It was supposed to be just another flight, another routine trip, but for Maria Simmons it would be an experience that would shake her to the core. As the airplane engines hummed softly, passengers settled into their seats, preparing for a smooth, uneventful journey. But one moment, one action, would change everything. The moment Maria boarded the plane, she felt an uneasy tension in the air. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was just her intuition. But something felt off. She sat down in her assigned seat, her eyes scanning the cabin as she adjusted her seatbelt. Across the aisle, she noticed the flight attendant, a woman with a tight smile and an overly polite tone, but Maria could tell there was something behind that smile. It was subtle, but unmistakable. As the flight attendant moved down the aisle, Maria felt a chill down her spine. Was it just her? Or was the flight attendant looking at her differently? But she brushed it off. Maybe she was imagining things. It was a common feeling many people get when they enter a new space, especially on a long flight. However, what happened next would prove that Maria wasn't just overthinking it. As the flight attendant approached, she stopped right beside Maria's seat. "Excuse me, miss," the attendant said, her voice icy. "Could you please move your bag from the seat? I need to ensure we have enough space for the rest of the passengers." Maria looked at the bag beside her, her purse, small, harmless, not even taking up an entire seat. "Of course," Maria replied with a polite smile, moving her bag. But as soon as she moved it, the attendant's gaze hardened. "Thank you," the flight attendant said, the words clipped and cold. "You should know the rules. It's a privilege to be on this flight." Maria froze. A chill swept through her as the words settled in her mind. The snide tone, the way she was singled out. And then, just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, the flight attendant made a comment under her breath. "You're lucky you're even on this flight." It was the comment that cut deep. Maria's eyes narrowed. Her heart raced. She had heard about discrimination, read about it, but now it was happening to her. A woman who, by all outward appearances, should have been just another polite airline staff member, had just insulted her, with a racial undertone no one could ignore. Maria tried to keep her composure. After all, she was traveling for business, and the last thing she wanted was a scene. But the comment lingered, festering in her mind. Was it really just a careless remark? Or did the flight attendant mean it in a way that could escalate? As the seconds ticked by, Maria decided she would have to face this head-on. She took a deep breath, looking around the cabin. The eyes of other passengers were quickly averted, but Maria wasn't backing down. Not this time. She was a woman who had fought too hard for everything she had, and she would not let this flight attendant, who assumed her status based on nothing but her race, get away with this. The flight attendant turned her back to go down the aisle. Maria opened her mouth to speak, but then a hand rested on her shoulder, and her heart skipped a beat. She turned to look, and standing there, right beside her, was her husband, Charles Simmons. Maria's gaze met his, and in that moment, everything changed. Maria's husband, Charles, had a reputation that preceded him. He was more than just a businessman, more than just a figure in the corporate world. His identity was one that commanded respect, but the flight attendant didn't know that yet. Would her opinion of Maria, and of this entire situation, change when she found out who he was? Maria stood up, meeting her husband's eyes. He could see the hurt in her gaze, the frustration. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He had been around long enough to know the weight of these kinds of moments. He had seen it happen before, but now the question was, how would this woman, this flight attendant, respond when she realized who she was dealing with? Would she apologize, or would she dig herself deeper, knowing she had already made a huge mistake? One thing was certain. This was just the beginning. She had worked hard to get where she was. A successful businesswoman in her late 30s, Maria was used to being in control. She knew the importance of making a lasting impression. Throughout her career, she had faced the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated field, but she had proven herself time and time again. Maria's rise to the top hadn't been easy. She had worked late nights, faced setbacks, and dealt with countless microaggressions from people who doubted her abilities. But with each challenge, Maria became stronger. She had learned to let go of the hurtful comments, focusing instead on her goals. She had built a name for herself in the business world, earning respect from colleagues and competitors alike. Her husband, Charles Simmons, was equally accomplished, but in a different way. Charles had always been the kind of person who commanded attention without trying. He wasn't flashy, but his presence was undeniable. He was a lawyer, well known in legal circles, and a key figure in the community. When they met years ago, Maria was drawn to his quiet strength and his unwavering sense of justice. Together, they made a powerful team. Maria and Charles had learned to balance each other's strengths. While Maria was bold, taking risks and leading her team with confidence, Charles was steady, thoughtful, and had a knack for calming tense situations. They complemented each other perfectly. Today, they were on a much-needed getaway. After weeks of intense work, both had been looking forward to this flight to visit some friends in another city. For once, Maria was looking forward to relaxing, to spending time with Charles without the weight of their careers hanging over them. They had no idea that this flight would be anything but relaxing. As they boarded the plane, everything seemed normal. The cabin was filled with a mixture of business travelers, vacationers, and families. Maria and Charles took their seats and settled in, smiling as they exchanged quiet words, making small talk about their plans once they landed. It felt like just another trip. It felt like a chance to escape from the stress of their everyday lives. But Maria had noticed something from the start. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the flight attendant's smile seemed forced. Her eyes, though polite, avoided direct eye contact with Maria. It wasn't the kind of thing that would raise alarms for most people, but Maria knew what it felt like to be subtly dismissed. She had experienced it before, growing up in a world where people like her were often seen as outsiders, in spaces they had every right to be in. Maria's instincts told her that something was off, but she pushed it aside. After all, it was just a flight. She was here to relax, not to get caught up in any drama. But as the flight attendant approached her seat, the tension she had felt earlier only grew. It wasn't just about the bag. There was something more. Maria could tell by the way the flight attendant addressed her, the tone of her voice, the dismissive body language. The words, though polite on the surface, felt pointed. "You should know the rules," the flight attendant had said, her voice carrying an edge Maria couldn't ignore. There was an underlying implication in those words that Maria, in her mind, couldn't shake off. The incident brought back memories of other moments in her life when she had been made to feel like she didn't belong. Whether it was being the only woman in a board meeting or the only black woman in a room full of people who looked nothing like her, Maria had experienced more than her fair share of these subtle jabs. But she had learned to ignore them, to rise above. Still, something about this moment felt different. As the flight attendant moved down the aisle, Maria took a deep breath, trying to push the feeling away. She glanced over at Charles, who was already settled in and reading a report for work. Charles didn't notice the exchange. He was focused, his mind already on the tasks ahead. He hadn't seen the moment of tension that had just unfolded between Maria and the flight attendant. Maria wasn't sure if she should confront the flight attendant or if she should just let it go. She hated letting things slide, especially when it came to injustice, but she also didn't want to make a scene. She was here to enjoy herself, not to get caught in another confrontation. But then again, how many times had she let things slide, only for those microaggressions to build up and become bigger issues later on? As she sat back in her seat, she noticed the flight attendant's cold expression. The woman wasn't just being distant. There was an air of superiority in the way she carried herself, as if she had already made up her mind about Maria, as if she thought she knew her place. Maria felt a knot form in her stomach, but what Maria didn't know was that this flight, this trip, would soon become a turning point. Because, as fate would have it, the moment that was about to unfold would not only change her life but also force everyone around her to reassess their own assumptions. It would force people to confront their biases and reconsider what it meant to stand up for what was right. In that moment, Maria knew she had to make a decision. Would she let it slide, as she had in the past, or would she stand up and confront this injustice head-on? She wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. Maria Simmons was not the kind of woman who would let this go without a fight. She had earned every right to be where she was. She was a woman who knew her worth. And soon, so would the flight attendant. The tension in the air grew thicker as the flight attendants made their rounds, preparing for takeoff. Maria tried to focus on the in-flight magazine in front of her, but the flight attendant's words kept echoing in her mind. "You should know the rules. It's a privilege to be on this flight." At first, Maria thought she might be overreacting. After all, it could have been just a routine remark. But something about the flight attendant's tone, sharp, condescending, lingered in the air like a cloud. Maria could feel her chest tightening, a mix of frustration and confusion building up inside her. As the minutes passed, Maria tried to shake it off. She glanced at Charles, who was still busy with his work, unaware of the uncomfortable exchange. His calm presence, as always, was reassuring, but Maria couldn't push the feeling aside. She had been here before. She had encountered these subtle forms of discrimination many times in her life, each one leaving a bruise, each one chipping away at her sense of belonging. But this time, it was different. Maria wasn't the same person who had let things slide in the past. She wasn't the same person who had stayed quiet, trying to ignore the insults and microaggressions. She had learned over the years that ignoring these things only allowed them to grow. She had become someone who knew her worth, someone who understood that standing up against injustice was not just about her. It was about the generations that would come after her, about the community, and about ensuring that everyone had the right to feel safe and respected. With a deep breath, Maria stood up and walked toward the flight attendant, her heart pounding in her chest. She could already feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some curious, others distracted, but none willing to intervene. Maria had seen this before. The silence of bystanders, the way people turn their heads when they know something isn't right, but don't want to be involved. But this time, she wasn't going to let that silence control her. She walked up to the flight attendant who was standing at the front of the cabin, making sure everything was in place for takeoff. The woman looked up, her smile fake, almost forced. "Yes, miss?" she asked, her voice as cold as before. "I need to speak with you," Maria said, her voice calm but firm. The flight attendant's eyes flickered with impatience. She seemed to assume this was just another routine complaint. "About what?" she asked, as if it was an inconvenience. "The way you spoke to me earlier," Maria began. "It wasn't just rude, it was insulting. And frankly, I don't appreciate it." For a moment, the flight attendant said nothing. She looked Maria up and down, sizing her up, her gaze filled with judgment. Maria could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She wasn't used to being called out, not like this. I'm not sure what you mean, the flight attendant said, crossing her arms. I was just doing my job. No, Maria replied, taking a step closer, her voice unwavering. You weren't just doing your job. You singled me out for something that wasn't even an issue. You made assumptions based on the color of my skin, and that's not acceptable. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed, but she didn't say anything. Her body language, however, told a different story. It was clear she was growing defensive, her posture stiffening. Maria stood her ground. She wasn't going to let this woman get away with treating her like this. Not today, not ever again. You've made me feel uncomfortable from the moment I boarded this plane, but I'm not going to stay silent this time. I know my rights, and I won't let you make me feel less than. The flight attendant's lips curled into a tight smile. I think you're overreacting, miss. We don't need any more complaints today. I'm just doing my job. Maria's patience was wearing thin. You're not just doing your job. You're disrespecting me, and I'm not going to let you dismiss me just because you don't like the way I look. Before the flight attendant could respond, a voice behind Maria broke through the tension. Is there a problem here? Maria turned around, and there, standing behind her, was Charles. His calm expression immediately softened the sharpness in the air. He had no idea what had just happened, but his presence seemed to change the dynamic of the entire situation. The flight attendant looked at him, her face suddenly nervous. No, sir, everything's fine, she said quickly. Just a small misunderstanding. Maria looked at her husband and could see the recognition in his eyes. He knew something was wrong. He stepped closer, giving the flight attendant a steady, unwavering look. The kind of look that only someone like Charles Simmons could give. One that demanded respect without even needing to say a word. I don't think this is a small misunderstanding, Charles said, his voice calm but filled with authority. My wife has every right to speak up if she's being treated unfairly, and from what I can see, this isn't just a misunderstanding. The flight attendant's expression faltered. Her forced politeness began to slip away. She had clearly underestimated the situation, not realizing that the woman she had been so dismissive of was married to someone with a significant reputation. Maria could see the change in the flight attendant's demeanor, but she wasn't sure if it was enough. Would this woman, now that she understood who Maria's husband was, suddenly change her tune? Would she apologize for her behavior, or would she double down on her assumptions? As the flight attendant stepped back, her posture slumping, Maria felt a sense of relief. She had stood her ground. But the real test was yet to come. Would the flight attendant truly understand the gravity of her actions? Or would this just be another case of someone in power getting away with disrespect? The tension in the cabin was thick, as if every passenger was holding their breath, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Maria stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest, but she was resolute. She had never been one to back down from a fight for fairness, and now she was determined to ensure that the flight attendant understood the weight of her actions. Charles, standing behind her, was as calm as ever, but there was an unmistakable authority in his stance. He wasn't just Maria's husband. He was a well-respected figure, someone who had the power to change the course of the situation with a few well-chosen words. The flight attendant, clearly rattled by his presence, seemed to shrink under his gaze. She wasn't sure if she had underestimated Maria, or if the reality of who she was dealing with was finally sinking in. Either way, her smugness was gone. "What's going on here?" A voice suddenly broke through the stillness. The captain, having heard the commotion from the cockpit, had stepped into the cabin, his face tense with concern. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the flight attendant said quickly, her voice much shakier than before. "This passenger, Mrs. Simmons, was upset with me, and I was just trying to explain the rules." Charles's sharp gaze never left the flight attendant. "You weren't just explaining the rules," he said. "You insulted my wife. You made assumptions about her, treated her like she didn't belong here, and that's not acceptable. And I'm not the only one who's noticed." The captain's eyes flicked between Maria and the flight attendant, clearly processing what was happening. He hadn't seen the earlier exchange, but it was obvious from the way the flight attendant was reacting that this wasn't just a trivial matter. He wasn't blind to the shift in the air. Maria's quiet strength and Charles's undeniable authority made it clear that this situation had escalated in a way that would not be easily ignored. "Sir, The flight attendant's words trailed off as she tried to regain her composure, but it was too late. Maria wasn't going to let her dismiss this with a weak apology or a change of subject. "No, it's not okay," Maria said, firmly, her voice rising slightly, but still controlled. "You don't get to make me feel less than. Not here, not anywhere. And the fact that you're trying to downplay this now only shows me that you still don't understand what you've done." Maria glanced at the other passengers who had been watching the confrontation unfold. Some had clearly seen what had happened, their eyes now flicking nervously between the flight attendant and Maria. Others looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to intervene. But Maria didn't need anyone to speak for her. She had already spoken for herself. "Is there anything else I can help with, Mrs. Simmons?" the captain asked, his voice soft but respectful now that the situation had come into focus. Maria shook her head, her voice steady. "I don't need anything from you. What I need is for you to hold your staff accountable. If she cannot treat passengers with respect, she should not be working on this flight." The flight attendant's face was flushed with embarrassment, but Maria didn't feel sorry for her. She wasn't here to give grace for poor behavior anymore. It was time for change. And if it started with this moment, then so be it. The captain nodded, his expression hardening. "Understood, ma'am. I will make sure this is handled properly when we land." Maria took a deep breath, glancing at Charles, who was standing beside her. He gave her a reassuring nod. He knew she had done the right thing. Maria wasn't looking for confrontation, but she also wasn't going to let herself be belittled or dismissed. She had worked too hard to be treated as anything less than equal. As the tension in the cabin began to ease, the flight attendant turned and walked back toward the rear of the plane, her posture still stiff, but now accompanied by a look of regret. It was clear that she understood the seriousness of what had just transpired. Maria turned to the captain once more. "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. "I appreciate you taking this seriously." The captain gave her a slight nod. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Charles looked at Maria, a proud smile spreading across his face. "You did good," he said quietly, just for her to hear. "I'm proud of you." Maria returned the smile, but inside, she knew this was more than just a small victory. It was a reminder that things had to change, that the fight wasn't over, and that her voice, as one person, had the power to make a difference. As the flight continued, Maria leaned back in her seat, Charles by her side. The cabin was quieter now, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. The passengers, once merely bystanders, now understood something they hadn't before. Maria had stood up for herself. She had confronted injustice head-on, and she wasn't going to let it slide anymore. The flight continued toward its destination, but Maria felt lighter now. It wasn't just about winning an argument or making the flight attendant apologize. It was about knowing that, no matter the circumstance, she would always have the courage to stand up for herself, and that, in the end, would always be enough. As the plane began its descent, Maria couldn't help but think about how much this moment had taught her. It wasn't about confrontation for the sake of it. It was about the responsibility we all carry to make sure everyone is treated fairly with respect. The world wouldn't change in one flight, but in that moment Maria knew that she had done something that mattered. And for that, she felt proud. As the plane descended toward its destination, Maria remained quiet, her mind still processing what had just happened. She sat next to Charles, who had his arm resting on the armrest, a calm, comforting presence beside her. The confrontation was over, but the emotions it stirred were still swirling inside her. Maria wasn't one to dwell on moments of conflict, but this felt different. This wasn't just about an unpleasant exchange with a flight attendant. It was a lesson, one she hoped would resonate with the people around her. And she wasn't going to forget it anytime soon. When the plane finally touched down, there was a moment of awkward silence as passengers began to gather their belongings, eager to exit the plane. But before anyone could leave, the captain walked to the front of the cabin, with the flight attendant following behind him. "Mrs. Simmons," the captain began, his voice sincere, "we take these matters very seriously, and I want to apologize once again for the situation you had to endure. I assure you that the flight attendant will be addressed appropriately." Maria nodded, but she didn't need an apology anymore. What she needed was action. She looked the captain in the eyes, not with anger, but with an unwavering determination. "I appreciate that," she said softly, "but I hope this isn't just a sorry moment. I hope this means the airline is committed to making real change." The captain's expression softened. "It does. I will personally ensure that further actions are taken. We will review our training programs to prevent situations like this from happening again. And rest assured, this will not go unaddressed." Maria felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't the apology she had wanted, it was the accountability, and that was all that mattered now. She had stood up for herself, and the captain was taking steps to ensure it wouldn't happen again. As the passengers exited the plane, Maria and Charles made their way down the jet bridge. Charles gave Maria a gentle squeeze on the shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of how proud he was of her. Maria glanced up at him, grateful for his quiet support. It wasn't easy to confront someone in authority, especially when the stakes were high. But Charles had always been there for her, both as a partner and as a reminder of her own strength. Once they were outside the terminal, Maria took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the ordeal finally lift from her shoulders. They headed toward the baggage claim area, where they would meet their friends. But even as she moved forward, she couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. Maria's fight wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, every person who had ever been judged based on their appearance, their race, or their background. Her voice had been a small but powerful reminder that those in positions of power couldn't simply dismiss people without facing consequences. By the time they reached the baggage claim, Maria's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the airline's customer service team. "Dear Mrs. Simmons," it began, "we would like to personally apologize for the unfortunate incident that took place during your flight today. We have already begun an internal review of our staff training protocols and have addressed this issue with the flight attendant involved. We are committed to ensuring that all of our passengers are treated with the utmost respect and dignity, and we are taking steps to improve our services. Thank you for bringing this matter to our attention." Maria read the email, her thoughts momentarily drifting. While she appreciated the airline's acknowledgement, she knew that real change would take time. It was a step in the right direction, but it was only the beginning. She looked at Charles, who was waiting for her with a small smile. "What do you think?" she asked, showing him the email. "It's a good start," Charles said. "But we both know that real change comes when people start taking a hard look at their own actions. This isn't just about one person. It's about creating a culture where respect and fairness are the baseline, not the exception." Maria nodded, agreeing with him completely. "You're right. It's about creating a future where no one ever has to go through what I did today." As they walked out of the airport, Maria felt a sense of pride settle in her chest. She had stood up for what was right, and in doing so had started a chain reaction. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a powerful step in the right direction. And as they drove to their destination, Maria realized something important. The power of standing up for yourself wasn't just about what happens in the moment. It's about the long-term impact of your actions. Today, Maria had made a statement not just for herself, but for all those who would come after her. The flight had ended, but the conversation was just beginning. As the story of Maria's confrontation with the flight attendant unfolded, one thing became clear. The power of standing up for yourself can create ripples that go far beyond the immediate moment. Maria's decision to not remain silent in the face of injustice didn't just change the course of her own flight. It sent a powerful message to everyone around her. It was a message about courage, accountability, and the need to fight for what is right, no matter the situation. Maria had the strength to confront someone in authority, but not everyone has that same kind of courage. How many times have you been in a situation where something didn't feel right? Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly, but hesitated to speak up because you didn't want to make waves? We've all been there. It's easy to feel like our voices don't matter, that speaking out could lead to conflict or worse, being dismissed entirely. But let me ask you this. If you don't stand up for what's right, who will? Maria's story isn't just about one woman standing up against a racist flight attendant. It's about all of us. It's about what happens when we refuse to let the little injustices slide, and when we choose to make our voices heard. It's about the larger impact we can have when we don't allow fear or uncertainty to hold us back. Think about the times you've stayed silent when you should have spoken up, whether it was witnessing discrimination, a workplace injustice, or even just seeing someone being treated poorly in public. Maybe you didn't know how to handle the situation. Maybe you didn't want to escalate things. But what if, in those moments, you chose to be like Maria? What if you chose to stand up, to demand respect, and to show the world that you won't accept unfair treatment? We all have a role to play in making the world a better place. It's not just about the big acts of courage that make headlines. It's also about the small, everyday moments when we choose to make a stand. The more we speak out against injustice, the more we push society in the right direction. It may not always be easy, but every time you speak up, you're making a difference. Now, imagine if everyone took a stand like Maria did. Imagine if every time someone was treated unfairly, someone stepped forward to say, "That's not okay." Imagine if we all took responsibility for the world we live in and held each other accountable. What kind of society could we create then? But speaking out isn't always easy. It's scary. It's uncomfortable. But we need to remember that change never happens in comfort. Change happens when we push through fear and take action. It happens when we decide that doing the right thing is more important than avoiding conflict. Just like Maria, you might not always know how things will turn out, but what matters is that you act. You stand up for justice, you demand respect, and you help make the world a better place for everyone around you. So, what can we learn from Maria's experience? First, we need to realize that standing up for ourselves and others doesn't have to be loud or confrontational. Maria wasn't yelling or making a scene. She simply stood firm in her conviction and spoke out calmly but assertively. She didn't back down because she knew that what was happening wasn't right. And that's a lesson for all of us. We don't need to shout to make a point. Sometimes, just calmly stating, "Our position," can be the most powerful statement of all. Second, we need to realize that standing up for what's right can sometimes be uncomfortable, but it is always worth it. Maria's decision to confront the flight attendant was not easy. It required courage, patience, and strength. But by doing so, she not only stood up for herself, but she also sparked a conversation that could lead to real change. She held people accountable and made sure that others wouldn't be treated the same way in the future. Now, think about your own life. Have you ever witnessed injustice and stayed silent? Have you ever thought to yourself, "It's not my problem," or "I don't want to make things worse"? Maria's story teaches us that we all have a responsibility to speak up. If we stay silent, we allow injustice to persist. But when we find the courage to speak, we give others permission to do the same. We make it clear that we will not stand by while others are being hurt or marginalized. So, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to make a choice? Stay silent or speak out? What did you do, and how did it feel? I know that every person's experience is different, and that's what makes this conversation so important. By sharing our stories, we can learn from each other and build a community of people who are committed to standing up for what's right. Think about this. If we all made an effort to speak out when we see something wrong, we could create a ripple effect of change. Each person who speaks out encourages someone else to do the same, and eventually, we could shift the culture, making respect and kindness the standard. But it all starts with one person. It starts with you. So I encourage you to reflect on your own experiences. If you've ever seen someone being treated unfairly, ask yourself, what could I have done? And if you're ever in a situation where you're the one facing injustice, ask yourself, how will I respond? Because your response matters. Your voice matters. Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this? How do you feel about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult? I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you believe in the message of this video, in the power of standing up for what's right, make sure to share and subscribe. Let's continue this conversation. Let's keep fighting for a world where respect and fairness are the norms, not the exceptions. Thank you for being here, for being part of this community, and for standing with us. Together, we can make a difference.